Good morning, everyone. Thank you for all coming out this morning. As you all know, it's the 11th of September of 2006. It's the 5 years as of almost the hour that we sit here together this morning out in Cape Cod that the 9/11 events took place, and we know that tonight is going to be the television show on ABC, The Path to 9/11, that is stirring such a major controversy in the country. The Republican Party is basically involved through cooperation with ABC television in attempting to sort of to blame 9/11 basically on the Democratic Party and Bill Clinton and his administration for failing to stop Al-Qaeda. And the Democratic Party is in an uproar, and Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is demanding that it be canceled and ABC not put the television show on because it's filled with lies and fabrications. And so that it's appropriate, I guess, that since the weekend after Labor Day here in the United States has come to mark the unofficial beginning of the presidential campaign in the United States every 4 years. This has been going on now for some almost 200 years, these elections. But it's also important, what I want to do today is I want to recall and refresh our recollection that it is also coming on to the week of the autumn equinox. And that has been going on now for some 4.75 billion years, occurring every year. And in this week, we've gathered together here in Martha's Vineyard to discuss, actually, the relationship between these two different perspectives. The one, the kind of short-term national perspective on the issues of the world, and this larger, more cosmic perspective that we might take on the passing of events. More specifically, I think our focus is going to be on this week the relationship between the internal topography of the bodily biophysical entity that has been generated by our material universe to basically house our consciousness, through the prism of which we both gather together data through this biophysical entity, and we process it through a process of making moral judgments about how we will conduct ourselves both individually and collectively as a community. And what I want to really be able to do is point out that we have a series of extremely important decisions coming up, these moral decisions, by use of our biophysical entity that we have and our consciousness, that we're going to be needing to make coming up in the year 2008 for our presidential and congressional elections, and on into the 21st century, by the end of which all of us here gather together, and all of us who are listening to this and watching this on the DVD will all have passed from this incarnation. And so we have a special obligation in this short period that we all get to spend together here in this incarnation to make the proper moral decisions, both for our own individual lives, but also for our collective life as a nation. Now, you'll note that I have not made reference here to the 2006 election coming up, because despite all of the best efforts on the part of the major media to pretend that there's a major drama getting ready to come up, and that maybe the Democratic Party will regain control of the United States House of Representatives and Senate, the fact of the matter is that most everyone with a political IQ above room temperature knows that that isn't going to happen. Because the fact is that the Democratic Party, in order to retake control of the House of Representatives, would have to win 15 seats in the Congress away from the Republican Party. And the fact of the matter is that the probabilities are in excess of 90% that they won't take more than 7 to 10 seats, though they will take some. Because in order for them to have regained control of the House of Representatives, they would have had to won the major litigation in Texas to set aside the gerrymandering of the 6 major congressional districts that Tom DeLay supervised down there. And because both major political parties, Republican and Democrat, have so systematically gerrymandered all of the congressional districts, the 435 congressional districts in the United States, so that there's upwards of 65% to, in some cases, 75% domination of just one political party in one of the 2 political parties in that congressional district. It's very, very, very difficult for anyone other than the incumbent of the dominating party in that district to win. That's by choice of both of the major national parties. And it's equally unlikely that the Democratic Party will be able to take back the United States Senate, because they would have to take 6 Senate seats away from the Republicans. And it's 90% likely that they won't really take back more than 2 or 3. One of them very possibly in Connecticut, Joseph Lieberman's Democratic seat that he now has lost the primary race to Ned Lamont, and Lamont is likely to win that back. And even if he weren't, then Lieberman will win, who is a Democrat. So they'll hold that seat. But the other one is in Connecticut, or excuse me, is in Pennsylvania, and that's Rick Santorum's seat. There's a substantial chance that the Republicans will lose that seat to the Democrats. But it's only a few seats that are basically going to change hands in the United States Senate. So I don't want to exercise the fiction here overall together that's very likely to happen. So I direct our attention in these discussions during the course of this week to the somewhat longer range decisions we have to make in 2008 with regard to the presidency and the House and Senate at that point in time, and on into the 21st century that we're going to be directing our attention to during the course of this week. Now, I want to just very briefly, though we touched upon it a little bit last night, when Rebecca asked us each to give a little intro to our background, I want to, in part because of the television audience, the DVD people who are going to be watching this, is give a little bit, just a bit of the background again to refresh our recollection, from which I come to this task of hoping to provide some genuinely new data to us here for our conversation during the course of the week. And as I pointed out last night, that for those of you here in the television audience who have heard of me at all, it's most likely that you heard of me in the context of being the Harvard Law School lawyer and constitutional lawyer that did the Iran-Contra case, that actually generated the scandal that brought about the major confrontation in the Iran-Contra special prosecutor, etc., that led to eventually George H.W. Bush, George Bush Sr., basically failing to win a second term, actually. And in descending order, those who hadn't heard of me in that context, who have heard of me at all, probably heard of me as the attorney for the Christic Institute. The Christic Institute, when we did for example, the American Sanctuary Movement, defenses for the people fleeing from Central America, who had been put on death lists by the kind of totalitarian governments in the various Central American countries, Guatemala and El Salvador specifically, who were being arrested here in the United States and detained and sent back to those countries by the Reagan-Bush administration. And after notifying the government that they would be coming back on a certain flight. And we represented them and got the major federal court order declaring it to be unconstitutional for the Reagan-Bush administration to be defying the United States Refugee Act that we have. And we also represented the people at 3 Mile Island and stopped the 3 Mile Island nuclear facility back in 1979 from pumping all the radioactive waste materials from their damaged facility into the Susquehanna River. And you may have heard of the case in Greensboro, North Carolina, where we did the major federal Civil Rights Act lawsuit against the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party, being the first one to establish a major civil rights action against them. But most of all, probably the Karen Soquid case. That people knew that the Christic Institute basically came together from doing the Karen Soquid case that actually struck down as unconstitutional the legislative cap that had been placed by Congress on the size of a monetary judgment that could be granted by an American civil jury against a private nuclear facility for contaminating and damaging people in the area. And because of that, from the day of that victory back in June of 1979, not a single private nuclear facility has been either ordered or built in the United States. And so but as I say, that is largely attributable to Sarah Nelson, who is here with us, who was the National Labor Secretary for the National Organization for Women at the time, that organized that Karen Soquid effort and directed that entire investigation litigation for the Christic Institute. But I want to point out again that it's not in this context that I come here this week in this kind of confrontational, dialectical, trial lawyer context. It's rather in my other incarnation that I've come here this week, and there are a number of aspects of this. That one of them is that rather than the Harvard Law School trained litigator and constitutional lawyer, that I come here actually as a Harvard College trained political scientist and a student of international relations, American foreign policy, as well as a Harvard Divinity School trained scholar in the field of comparative social ethics. And that's the kind of incarnation that I come in here to talk about this concept of comparative ethical systems that we need to talk about here to educate ourselves, to prepare to make these kind of ethical judgments that we need to make, both in 2008 and on into the 21st century. I also come in my capacity as a former 10-year chief counsel for the United States Jesuit headquarters in Washington, D.C., their National Social Ministry Office, where I was responsible for supervising the development of the public policy positions for the United States Jesuit Order of the Catholic Church for the United States. And in that capacity served as the national chairman of the Human Rights Committee for the interfaith community for the top 54 major mainstream religious denominations in the United States. And also in my capacity as, in the year 2000, at the end of the Cold War, having been asked by former Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev's staff to become the director of the post-Cold War strategic initiative to attempt to identify a new post-Cold War paradigm to replace the previous dialectical paradigms, confrontational paradigms of mere anti-communism that sort of drove and configured American foreign policy for almost 80 years between the October Revolution of 1917 all the way up to December 31st of 1991 with the voluntary dissolution of the Soviet Union on the one hand, and on the other hand the dialectical paradigm of anti-capitalism, which had driven all of the policies of the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc nations for that same period of time. So we were seeking that kind of post-Cold War, non-dialectical worldview that might be shared with the New World leaders. Now there's a few more esoteric aspects of my other incarnation, other than a trial lawyer, that I want to put forward so you'll know, in a sense, where I'm coming from during the course of our discussions this week. And that was in the year 2004. I was the chairman of the National Policy Committee for Dennis Kucinich in the 2004 presidential campaigns. And as you know, Dennis Kucinich is the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus in the United States House of Representatives. And you probably will also recall back in the year 2004 presidential race, he's the one who had it right. And he's the one, the candidate that insisted, contrary to the other candidates, that the authority not be given to George W. Bush by the United States Congress to authorize him to use military force against Saddam Hussein over this assertion that there were all these nuclear weapons in Iraq, that Dennis Kucinich had asserted, pursuant to his policies, that was not at all persuasive, the evidence that they were setting forth to assert this fact. And it was not at all demonstrated that Saddam Hussein had anything whatsoever to do with 9/11, and that this fiction that was attempting to be generated by the Bush administration was just that. That it wasn't just accidental, that it was conscious, and it was a fabrication. And that someone among the candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination ought to have the clarity of vision to say so. Unlike Hillary Clinton, unlike the other candidates that we're talking about, and John Kerry, that all voted to give this authority to George W. There's a couple other final capacities that I want to let you know that I come here in, and that is that in the year 1992, that I was one of the people who played a significant role in persuading Ross Perot to run for the presidency in 1992 against George Herbert Walker Bush, and caused him, he ended up winning 19% of the popular vote and taking it away from George Bush Sr., thereby enabling Bill Clinton and Al Gore to win the presidency in 1992 with only 43% of the popular vote in the United States. And the final aspect of this incarnation is that I worked with the Jimmy Carter presidential campaign with Stu Eisenstadt, that was his policy chief, back in 1976, to establish the Carter position in the campaign and later in his administration on human rights, insisting upon cutting off all American military aid to any foreign dictatorship that was found to systematically violate the human rights of their own citizenry, which resulted in the cutting off of U.S. military funding to Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua, causing the downfall of the Nicaraguan government, and also cutting off the foreign military aid to the Shah of Iran, bringing about the downfall of the Iranian government under the Shah of Iran and the Savak. which of course, as we now realize, led very quickly in turn to the Iran-Contra scandal of Nicaragua, Contras, and Iranian government. So it's in those capacities, as well as the assistant New York State campaign chairman for George McGovern back in 1972, where I ran voter registration for the National Democratic Party and stuff at that time. So I have this other set of incarnations, other than this kind of aggressive, hostile, antagonistic attorney that just files suit against all these bad guys. I've been trying at the same time to set up some kind of an understanding of the alternative set of worldviews that we actually have available to us as human beings, pursuant to which we can discern and advocate alternative policies to these policies of this other worldview that we see reflected now in the George W. Bush administration, which is this classical, dialectical, confrontational, second paradigm dialectic worldview. So in this capacity, this less confrontational capacity, I want to present to us here at the beginning of our discussions here on Monday morning, on this rather special day of 9/11, 5 years following the major tragic events of 9/11. I want to put before us at the beginning of this week 10 rather heretical theses, very, very similar actually in a way to those that Martin Luther nailed up on his 40 theses that he nailed up on the Catholic Church door at Wittenberg on October 31st of 1517. So I want to set forth these 10 heretical theses so that we'll have them in front of us to address during the course of the week, to the extent to which the group chooses to do so. And so what this will be this morning, in brief, will be sort of a 1 mile wide and 1 foot deep just articulation of the 10 theses that I think make up the parameters of the issues that I would think would be helpful for us to discuss during the course of this week. The first of these theses is that I believe that here, approaching the year 2008 presidential election and congressional elections, that we are in a very, very special historical moment, and that we're on the very brink in our country of making the tragic historical mistake of allowing our nation to transition into a national security state, a permanent national security state of a fascist dimension, by making the mistake of electing John McCain to the American presidency. Because McCain is going to be undoubtedly the Republican Party's nominee for the presidency, and I believe he's going to pick as his vice presidential running mate former New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, and that the two of them together are going to embrace and endorse the reactionary principles, policies, and programs of the George W. Bush administrations that we've seen in power for the last 8 years here in the United States, and all of their neo-conservative positions, which is in fact just a cuter word for reactionaries, which is what they are, and that those policies will be adopted, and the difficulty is that people are going to think that they ought to vote for John McCain just because he's such a nice guy and he actually disagrees with torture. And that because he disagrees with torture that the administration is advocating, that he's a better guy. And so, as I mentioned last night, I think that it's important for us to grasp and understand that our country is on the very brink of getting ready to elect the one-eyed man as king in the land of the blind, simply because he doesn't support torture. And he's a kind of a nice fellow and has high favorable ratings, among everybody, among the conservatives, among the moderates, and surprisingly enough, even among the liberals. He has an 80% favorable rating. So that's the first thesis that I want to put forward, is that is in fact what's getting ready to happen here in the United States. Number two thesis is that if in fact the National Democratic Party nominates New York Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton as their presidential nominee, that Senator Clinton will in fact, if she is chosen as the nominee, following the first two caucuses and the first two primaries, the first two caucuses being in the state of Iowa in the first week of January, and then following in Nevada, and then in the first two caucuses taking place in New Hampshire, or excuse me, the primaries in New Hampshire and in South Carolina, that by the second week in February, she would be the nominee of the National Democratic Party. And that if she is the nominee, she will pursue and will constantly advocate a consistently conservative set of principles, policies, and programs in the field of U.S. foreign policy in Iraq and in Afghanistan, in Iran, with regard to North Korea, because she will be afraid not to be a conservative. She'll think that that's the way she has to act in order to win the presidency, and especially as the first woman president, will have to follow a conservative set of policies, both in the foreign policy area and in U.S. military policy. And a subset of this second thesis is that she will pursue consistently a merely moderate position with regard to all of the domestic policies in the United States, from energy policy to environmental policy, with the sole exception of the issue of women's rights. And that it's my thesis that if this happens, if Senator Clinton is the nominee of the party, and that she will pursue these conservative foreign and military policy in positions, in these merely moderate positions on domestic policy, and she in fact will lose in the general election to Senator McCain, probably 63 to 57%, because she will not be able to out-conservative John McCain. And if she only challenges the George W. Bush administration policies simply on the grounds of their incompetency in their performance of policies, rather than disagreeing with the policies themselves, as she keeps on consistently saying, that she doesn't disagree with having gone into Iraq, she doesn't disagree with staying in Iraq, she just thinks that the war wasn't really handled well, and that they didn't put in enough troops, and they didn't give them enough armor. You know, that type of a campaign is not going to beat John McCain. Thirdly, my third thesis is that the only nationally recognized person, either male or female, Republican or Democrat or Independent, that the only one in the Democratic Party that can keep Hillary Clinton from winning the Democratic Party nomination and losing to John McCain is in fact Senator John Edwards, former senator from North Carolina, who was the Democratic Party nominee for vice president in 2004. This is because, in my judgment, number one, Al Gore is not in fact going to run. Al Gore has stated, and he stated on NBC Meet the Press, and therefore for full publication, that he does not believe that he can advocate the kind of policies that need to be followed by our government to solve the global warming crisis or any other major crisis and still be a candidate in either major political party. One cannot make a statement like that and win the nomination to the Democratic Party, because it means that he will not dare take the policy positions that he knows personally are necessary to solve problems and win the Democratic nomination. So he won't do that. Secondly, John Kerry will run and is going to run again, and he has told his finance chairman in New York State that he is going to be running again. He has some $14 million left over from his campaign funds from the year 2004, because he didn't use them to challenge the violations of law in the voting in the election in either Florida or Ohio. And the Democratic, he had stored up $14 million into a major fund to finance those type of challenges because he had to, because of what happened in the year 2000, and he never spent a nickel of that. And so he's got those funds, so he's going to run again. But he, in fact, will run in the primary the same basic kind of lackluster campaign that he ran in 2004. And the simple fact is that he cannot out-war hero John McCain, who was, was a prisoner of war in Vietnam and a pilot, military pilot, and John Kerry is not going to be able to succeed in doing that. And for him to mount the same campaign where he takes a conservative foreign policy and conservative military policy and merely moderate positions on the environment isn't going to beat John McCain. And so he's not going to be the nominee. And Senator Evan Bayh, whom many of you don't know for good reason, is the chair of the Democratic Leadership Council and is a senator from Indiana. He's way too tepid, both in personality and in policies, to beat John McCain, and he's not going to be able to win the nomination, even though he's the chairman of the Democratic Leadership Council, with his kind of tepid, middle moderate positions on things. Fourthly, Senator Joe Biden is going to run from Delaware. Joseph Biden is just too slick by a full half. And he's viewed by everybody as kind of the used car salesman of the Democratic Party. And it was not, in fact, just anomalous that back in 1992, when he was, in fact, running for the presidency, that it was found out that he was plagiarizing things in his speeches and saying that these things happened to him when he was a child, and they never happened to him. They happened to a particular Irish politician in Ireland that was running and had done all these same speeches. And so it's not coincidence. That was not, in fact, a function of Joe Biden's brain tumor that he later had removed, in fact, which he has attempted to convince everybody. It's how Joe Biden is. And everybody will find that out sooner than later. And so he's not going to win. And the final candidate is Russ Feingold from Wisconsin. He's going to be running, but in fact, and he's a genuine progressive. But in fact, when he was interviewed on NBC Meet the Press, and he was quoted to him, said, "You have said that John McCain is a very good guy. You said that the Republican Party might smarten up and actually nominate a straight shooter like John McCain, and that you've agreed with John McCain on many policies. So, what is your position, Senator Feingold, if John McCain is the nominee of the Republican Party? and you're the nominee of the Democratic Party. At which point he said, well, John McCain would certainly beat me. And I might take the position that he's absolutely right in that, as he is in many of his other policy positions. But that doesn't really, inure one to being the President of the United States. Or actually does inure one to being the President of the United States. And it just doesn't recommend them to be the presidential candidate. So that's my third thesis, is that John Edwards is the only one who can genuinely win the Democratic Party nomination other than Senator Clinton. And the fact of the matter is, my fourth thesis is, and it's important for a community like ours here, and probably those listening, is that only the Democratic Party nominee for the presidency is going to be able to beat John McCain. There's not going to be some third party candidate, like there was Ross Perot in 1992. The Green Party isn't going to be able to put up such a candidate. No person of national prominence is going to accept the Green Party nomination. Nobody's going to run for the Reform Party nomination. The John Hageland isn't going to win for the Transcendental Meditation Party. There's not going to be, according to my fourth thesis here, there's not going to be anybody else. So it's going to be whoever the Democratic Party nominee is that's going to be the only one who's going to be able to beat John McCain. My fifth thesis of the 10, so we're at the halfway point here, is that while Senator Clinton is not going to be able to beat John McCain by simply advocating this consistent set of conservative military and foreign policies and moderate domestic policies, John Edwards is not going to be able to beat John McCain by advocating simple, moderate, middle-of-the-road positions on foreign policy, military policy, or domestic policy, and rely upon just being this bright, shining personality. That just isn't going to cut it. And so therefore, my sixth thesis here is, and I'm assuming this is true, but it's a thesis at this point, is that all of us here gathered this week together, and virtually everyone who's listening to this particular videotape, other than the FBI and the NSA, all want to stop John McCain and Giuliani from being the President and Vice President of the United States between 2008 and 2016, and to stop our country from being dragged into becoming a national security state of the fascist stripe of Germany in the 1930s, even though John McCain seems to be a nice guy. And even though Rudolph Giuliani was in fact brave and very courageous and stuff in response 5 years ago this morning to the events that were happening in New York City, no one gainsays either of those points. But the fact of the matter is, none of us here want them to be president and vice president and to continue these types of reactionary policies that are going to drag us into this national security state status. Now, my seventh thesis is, in light of the fifth thesis about Senator Edwards not being able to beat John McCain with simple middle moderate positions, it's my thesis that Senator John Edwards does not, in fact, plan to run a middle moderate road campaign, but that he's in fact going to be running a populist, progressive campaign with progressive principles, policies, and programs. That, very importantly, the key point of this seventh thesis is going to be a set of policies that basically endorse the public policy positions that have been taken by the 54 major mainstream religious denominations in the United States. Over the past 30 years, the major 54 religious denominations in the United States have been working together to formulate a set of consistent policies on all 24 of the major public policy issue areas that generate full-scale cabinet-level positions in the executive branch and generate standing committees in the House and Senate. And that it's my thesis that Senator John Edwards is going to, in fact, embrace those policy positions on everything from defense to foreign policy to health care to labor policies to women's rights issues, virtually all the way across the board. And that this is in fact going to enable him not to try to out John McCain, such as Hillary Clinton would try to do. It will empower him to take on John McCain and confront John McCain and the right-wing Christian fundamentalists in this country who have dragged the Republican Party from being a merely conservative party into being a genuinely reactionary political party in our country. And that by taking on John McCain in that way, he's going to be able to beat him, because he will basically mount a campaign of the youth of our country against the old ways of militarism and that kind of right-wing politics. And that youth against old age of John McCain is going to win this election if he goes down that road. Now, the eighth thesis that I want in front of us specifically is very important to agree on this thesis, if we do, that the public policy positions that have been advocated by the 54 mainstream religious denominations in the United States over the last 30 years, since the end of the 60s, are in fact consistently progressive positions. They're not conservative positions, and they are not even moderate positions. They are progressive positions on virtually every one of the 24 policy areas, and that they're not rooted in the theistic worldview of the seventh paradigm of the spectrum of 8 worldviews. That it is in the sixth paradigm, progressive natural law tradition, that the major religious denominations in the United States have formulated their policy positions self-consciously to avoid falling prey to a challenge of violating the First Amendment to the Constitution, of attempting to impose upon people views that come from a specifically theistic set of presumptions. They have instead, as a matter of tactic, adopted the natural law worldview that does not require people accepting the theistic proposition that our universe was enfolded into being out of an infinite and eternal sea of entirely undifferentiated consciousness that remains the one thing that is not a thing among other things. The Yahweh God, the infinite and eternal, without name, of constant being. That fundamental theistic cosmological presumption is not made by the major policy positions of the mainstream churches in the United States for specific self-conscious reasons. And therefore, their positions are in fact progressive positions from the sixth paradigm worldview, which we'll discuss if you choose to. My ninth thesis, and the next to the last thesis, is that all true liberals and all true progressives and all true genuine seventh paradigm utopianists, as well as many true moderates, will want to stop John McCain and Rudolph Giuliani from becoming president and vice president, because of their embracing of the reactionary worldview and the policies, the principles, policies, and programs of the George W. Bush administration. Our people are sick and tired of these reactionary views. As long as they have a really consistent, progressive set of policies put in front of them and articulated and advocated, rather than trying to mealy-mouth your way into copying John McCain and just pretend that you're a little more competent than the Republicans, that they can be stopped. And if, in fact, all true liberals, progressives, and utopianists, and even moderates want to stop them, that they should do the following things. It's my thesis, my ninth and almost final thesis here. First, that we should all familiarize ourselves in as much detail as we can with the officially adopted and publicly endorsed positions, national policy positions of the 54 major mainstream religious denominations in our country. You can get access to these policy positions on an interdenominational basis by contacting the Washington Interreligious Staff Council in Washington, D.C. And they are at the National Methodist Building at 110 Maryland Avenue in Washington, D.C., immediately next door to the United States Supreme Court and directly across the street from the United States Capitol Building. If you would like to get them from a specifically Protestant perspective, though they're the same policy positions, and rather than on an interdenominational basis, you can contact the National Council of Churches up at the God Box at 475 Riverside Avenue in New York City. Just call the office of the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches, who's Bob Edgars, who is a former very liberal United States congressman from the city of Philadelphia. He is now the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches and is the director of a major association of former clergy in the United States advocating progressive public policy change through the National Council of Churches. If you'd like to get these policy positions from the perspective of an evangelical perspective, which many liberals are concerned about, there is a very progressive evangelical community known as the Sojourners community in Washington, D.C., the president of whom is Jim Wallace, the author of the Politics of God. And they have established a major new movement which is called the Covenant for a New America. And it sets forth a lot of these major policy positions in the covenant. And they have combined together to form a new movement in the United States called the Renewal Movement. And you can contact them in Washington, D.C., and I'll be able to give you the number in my closing comments. If you want to get them from a Catholic perspective, you contact the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. Call Tom Quigley. Tom Quigley is the head of the policy office for the Catholic Church there, and he's got all of these available for you. And if you want to approach it from a Jewish point of view, contact the Union of American Hebrew Congregations in Washington, D.C. Call Rabbi David Saperstein and get those positions from them. So that's the first thing that I think that we should all do if we view ourselves as a genuine liberal or a progressive or even a utopianist or even a rational moderate. That this is the first thing that one should do. Secondly, one should deeply refamiliarize yourself, all of us, ourselves, with the natural law tradition of our American constitutional government, to come to understand how profoundly fundamental the natural law worldview is to the entire theory of individual human rights, of democratic processes, of parliamentarian representative government. That there's a whole major course taught on this in social ethics at Harvard Divinity School and virtually every other divinity school in the country. the natural law tradition, you'll want to familiarize yourself with its cosmology that is distinct and categorically different than the theistic cosmology. You'll want to familiarize yourself with its teleology, which is its theory of how the universe is unfolding from the moment of its creation into whatever direction it's moving, and what role our human family plays, if any, in participating in this co-creational unfolding. That's the teleological presumption of this worldview. You'll want to familiarize yourself with the epistemological position of this worldview, which is a big fancy word for having to do with what particular faculties and capacities our human beings have by means of which we can gather data. Are we in fact restricted to simply our 5 physical senses in our intellect, or do we have other faculties? More importantly, is there a fundamental intuitional faculty? A faculty by means of which each individual can experientially encounter the unitive phenomenon that bonds together every single non-reducible integer of matter in the entire physical cosmos into one single unified harmonic whole. And are we capable, as a direct result of that direct immediate experience, to be able to discern experientially what forms of human conduct, individually or collective, are in harmony with this basic unified reality, or in disharmony to it? And that is a fundamental epistemological assumption of the 6th paradigm intuitive natural law worldview, that we are in fact gifted with that faculty. And because of each individual's being gifted with that faculty from the universe, we are each capable of making normative judgments about what's right and wrong. And therefore, we are each entitled to participate in the collective decision-making process of our human community, which is the underlying premise of the issue of democracy. And it is from this worldview that dates back to 350 BC of the ancient Stoical tradition of Greek philosophy and Western civilization that this belief comes from. And rather than to distinguish it simply as uniquely part of Western civilization, this is the experience that I mentioned Dr. Zhenzhou Jing, who is the chairman of the Department of Technology of the Chinese Academy of Social Science, when we were discussing this very issue at the State of the World Forum at the end of the Cold War. She smiled and she said, you forgive my language, English, she said, but we know this in China 6,000 years. But we not know you know this. And you'll want to familiarize yourself with the philosophy of the natural law tradition, which is classical Pythagorean Stoical philosophy of the Greek tradition, with the political philosophy, the progressive political philosophy, the mode of spiritual expression of this unique mode of spiritual expression, and ultimately its social form, which, as you might guess, is the constitutional, social democratic, parliamentarian form of government. Thirdly, according to this 9th thesis that I have, the third thing that you'll want to do, and this is very, very important, each of us will want to familiarize ourselves with the Chautauqua movement in the United States that went on from 1890 to 1917. And this was the historical progressive movement that was generated by the American church community in response to the exact same principles, policies, and programs that we see manifest in the George W. Bush administration as the neocon positions that were asserted by the McKinley administration under the political advisorship of Mark Hanna, who is the hero and role model of Karl Rove. And Karl Rove, if anyone were about to ask him, will tell you that Mark Hanna is his role model. And when you look back to see who Mark Hanna was and what it is he recommended, what he recommended was the principles, policies, and programs that generated the huge sucking of resources into the maw of the American corporations and setting up the major trusts and the banking cartels, the oil cartels, the railroad cartels, that in fact became the bane of our political existence in America in the late 19th century and generated this entire manifest destiny, the white man's burden, international imperialism of the late 19th century, believing that the elite ruling class of the country ought to have all of the resources given up into their hands, and that they would then utilize them for their own personal profit, and that any additional value might trickle down to the rest of the community. And if it didn't trickle all the way down to the bottom, so much the better. Because that's what social Darwinism is all about. And that is the mode of ethical reasoning of their worldview. So the American religious community generated the entire Chautauqua movement between 1890 and 1917 to respond to this. And it is the Chautauqua movement in the United States that is the origin of the women's suffrage movement in the United States. One of their major speakers was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who went around throughout the country advocating women's suffrage and generated the 19th Amendment in 1919 for women's right to vote. It generated the American labor movement. Another one of their major speakers was W.E.B. Du Bois, constantly advocating that the workers organize themselves. It was also the origins of the American public education movement, with John Dewey being another one of their major speakers going around the country in the Chautauqua. It was the origin of the American environmental movement and conservation movement, with speakers going around. It was in fact the origin of the American progressive movement that gave rise to the progressive era in the United States. And so this came from the churches, the mainstream churches in the United States. And so I would recommend that all of you go to your local public library, look under the Chautauqua movement. It's CHAUTAQUE, the Chautauqua movement. And if you want more information about it, you can contact the Chautauqua Institute up in Chautauqua, New York, the director of which is Reverend Joan Brown Campbell, the former General Secretary of the National Council of Churches. Of 8 worldviews. And as I mentioned last night, it is not coincidental that there are 8 human worldviews. In the same way that there are 8 primary colors in our spectrum that we can see, that range from the red to the orange to the yellow to the green to the blue to the indigo and violet, which when taken all together generate white light. In the same way that it's not coincidental that there are 7 primary notes in our scale that go from the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. This is the full range of the octave, because, as I mentioned last night, we are, according to my thesis that I'm putting forth here, that we are incarnated in this material realm in a vibrational frequency which has itself generated the very faculties by means of which we discern the material reality in an octave set. And that's why we can perceive these primary colors, and we can resonate with these pure tones. And that is who we are. And that, therefore, I think we should familiarize ourselves with each of the other 7 worldviews, because each of these worldviews, in its higher manifestation, is in fact a perfectly solid and, let me be clear, essential aspect of our human personality. in the same way that each of the chakras in our human body is absolutely essential. Just like the root chakra at the base of our spine, the red light energy source in our body that generates our human life and our will to attach ourselves to surviving is absolutely essential to each and every one of us. Just as essential, no less, no more, than our heart chakra. No more or no less than our 7th chakra, crown chakra. No more than our 6th chakra, of the source of our intuition. That all of these faculties, there is a faculty that we have evolved biologically and teleologically over many millions of years for each and every one of these vibrational frequencies. And that's why we don't have 5 senses only, and it's why we don't even only have 6 senses. That we in fact have 8 senses. The 6th sense being, of course, the intuition that we all refer to, the 6th sense. The 7th sense is that spiritual faculty, which is not exactly the same as the intuitional faculty. The intuitional faculty of the 6th paradigm does nothing more, but I hasten to add nothing less than, enable us to immediately, experientially, and physically encounter the physical unitive phenomenon that bonds every single integer of matter in the universe into a physical harmonic whole. That is no mean feat. But it's not the same thing as the spiritual faculty that enables us to have access to the infinite and eternal, that abides beyond the parameters of our physical cosmos, which is not the domain of our public policy making. But the other domain that we do lay claim to as human beings is the entire physical realm of our cosmos. Now there is another 8th faculty in the waiting that abides in the 8th chakra, above our heads and beyond the physical constraints of our body, but still a part of the unitive energy field of which we are an integral being. And that is the one that when we begin to open that as a human family, we will evolve to the next phase of our evolution. That we will evolve from Homo sapien to Homo divinus. And that is the point at which we will then open to and realize the huge galactic community of which we are a part, and which now only abides as a potential mythology. And yet we hear it knocking on our door, and we hear all about it with these alleged extraterrestrial beings and people from other dimensions, and that it's all in the realm of mythology at the present time, as is every new faculty as it is beginning to be born. So I would recommend that we familiarize ourselves with all of these worldviews, and that we come to grasp the understanding that our role is to attempt to facilitate people, not to condemn their worldview, not to insist that just one single worldview is the only right worldview, any more than just one single charism of one single chakra in the human body is the right one, and all the others are wrong. You know, that what we need to do is to familiarize ourselves with all the other worldviews and understand that our role is not to try to condemn and convert everyone from their worldview to ours, but to facilitate them rising from the lower manifestation of their own worldview into its higher manifestation. Because in the same way that in the 2nd paradigm worldview, the lower manifestation of that worldview is dialectics, of confrontation, of seeking to destroy the ultimate other, to in fact derive one's entire sense of well-being solely and exclusively from the degree to which you effectively vanquish the ultimate other. as I mentioned last night, even to the point of when you begin to lose another ultimate other, like when the Soviet Union collapsed, that you will then hurry right up to make another one, like the terrorists that are all around us. And in failing to be able to create another one, you will become the ultimate other. And that is the threat that our country is facing now. The threat of becoming the ultimate other to everyone else in the world. Of becoming the new Germany that will attempt to make war on the rest of the world, to attempt to crush them and make them submit to us, pursuant to the worldview of the projection of the new American century, of imposing upon them our own idiosyncratic view of the world. More pointedly, our Caucasian-based superiority of manifest destiny and the white man's burden that we see occurring now in the Middle East. So I'm suggesting that what we do is, rather than demonize every other worldview than our own, we come to recognize that the people who are acting from a particular worldview in a damaging way are functioning just from the lower manifestation of their own worldview. And that we can facilitate them rising into the higher manifestation of their own worldview. So that, for example, those who are trapped in the dialectic of the second paradigm and its lower manifestation rise to the Taoist worldview, where they come to see that this perceived antipodal energy in the universe is just a binary dance of a unified entity, dancing in harmony and moving with each other and giving each other energy. And that's the difference in those two lower and higher manifestations, just that one single worldview. So this is the fourth thing that I think we should all be doing. If, in fact, during the course of the week we come to believe that these 10 theses are correct, these are the specific things that I would recommend pursuant to this 9th thesis that we each do. The 5th of these is that we contact the national campaign of Senator John Edwards, and that we determine whether he is in fact going to be adopting these basic positions of the mainstream religious denominations. Is he in fact going to be putting forth a genuinely progressive and populist campaign, as distinct from a kind of middle marginalist campaign? Is he in fact going to be doing that? And you can call Fred Barron, who is his national campaign chairman. He would love to get your call. After about the 100th, he'll probably call me and say, "How is this happening? Why have you done this to me?" But the fact of the matter is, when the odds are presently, 60% probable that Senator Clinton is going to get the nomination, they should be grateful for every phone call they get from people like you and people who are listening now. And even if it goes directly to Fred Barron as the campaign chief, let him assign somebody to take all the calls. And you can call Fred at 202-449-7628. That's 202-449-7628. And see if you want to become involved in that campaign, both to make sure that it happens the way that it's supposed to, and if so, that it succeeds. Now, on the other hand, if you don't want to become associated with a particular political person, then I would suggest that what you do is participate with all of us in trying to generate a new Chautauqua movement around the country, so that the gatherings like this that we're having here on Martha's Vineyard, here on the anniversary of 9/11, can take place all across the country between now and 2008 in November, so that tens of thousands of gatherings of this nature will be generated. Because in the summer of 1914, just before the First World War, the efforts on the part of the national religious community in pursuant to the Chautauqua movement to raise up an alternative ethic, an alternative worldview to that of Mark Hanna and the neocons of that time. In the summer of 1914, there were in the United States 12,500 Chautauqua meetings that were held that summer. And so that it's been done before by our people in this country. It can be done again if we move from this point. If one chooses not to become directly involved in John Edwards' direct campaign, to move in this other direction. In order to do this, then contact the Chautauqua Institute up in northern New York, in Chautauqua, New York. You can also call the call to renewal that I talked about from the Sojourners community. You can reach them at 202-328-8842 in Washington, D.C. That's 202-328-8842. And you ask them to send to you a copy of the Covenant for a New America and see what you think about the content of it. You can also get a copy of Jim Wallace's book, The Politics of God, and read that and see if you agree with that, so that we can participate in generating this new Chautauqua. So those are the 5 things that I'm suggesting concretely one can do in the 9th thesis that I've suggested. Now the 10th and final thesis that I would put in front of us for our discussion this week is that if we all do these things that I am suggesting, those of us who view ourselves to be liberals or progressives or utopianists or even true moderates, if we all do these things, we can transform this special historical moment from the potential tragedy that it could become if we were to elect John McCain and Rudolph Giuliani. We can, in fact, transform this special historical moment into a major triumph for the progressive worldview, because, pursuant to my thesis number 10, William Strauss and Neil Howe were correct in their thesis they set forth in a book called Generations, A History of America's Future. It was published in 1991. And in this particular thesis that they set forth, it was based on a major long-term study that they did, an empirical study based upon inductive research that they did, that they came to a certain set of conclusions, which I'd be more than happy to talk about at greater length as we discuss this as the week goes on, or in response to particular questions. In Generations, A History of America's Future, which I would explicitly recommend that you all get a copy of, and you sit down and read it, they assert there that we are at the very brink of breaking through into an absolutely trans-historical, politically demographic moment in Western civilization, in which the largest and the best educated generation in the history of the human family, that is, the post-World War II idealist baby boom generation, is on the brink of joining forces with the second largest and newly best educated generation in the history of the world, the new millennial generation. Because just here in the United States, there are 82 million members of the idealist baby boom generation and 75 million members of the new civic millennial generation. So that together they make up some 162 million Americans out of a voting public of approximately 300 million. And it doesn't take a Rhodes Scholar or an MIT graduate to work those numbers out. Because if Strauss and Howe are correct, then this alliance between the idealist generation of the 21st century and the civic generation of the 21st century is going to generate a major coalition that will come into supporting the basic worldview of the natural law worldview. And that they will generate a wave of progressive, popular, democratic changes in the United States and throughout Western civilization between 2012 and 2020. And this, in fact, can become the major changing event of 2012 rather than some feared apocalyptic destruction of the world that people keep on talking about. Whereas on the other hand, if this is not done, and John McCain and Rudolph Giuliani ascend to the presidency and vice presidency of the United States in 2008 and continue down the road toward fascism and the national security state in our country and endorse the ongoing imperialistic ventures of this dialectical worldview, then in fact by 2012 we could be entering onto the beginning of the worst experience that can possibly be experienced here in the 21st century. And that will take two forms. One will be the irrevocable onset of massive global warming with the meltdown of our polar caps, the desalinization of our oceans to the point of altering the currents, the warm water currents, and changing the climates of the major continents in the temperate zone of our planet, and a major thermonuclear confrontation between a new northern industrial alliance of all the Caucasian nations of the world against China, which will result in a major thermonuclear confrontation between this new Western alliance and China, which can bring about the total termination of the ongoing biological experiment of our universe in having generated our human family, which would be the major tragedy for our galactic community, to lose out on the opportunity to have our human family participate as part of this galactic civilization. So those are my 10 theses, and I've presented them to you just so that we'll have something to talk about here as we gather together this week. And you may have questions. I'm perfectly willing to explain any part of them, and we'll have them to discuss during the course of the week as we go on. Thank you. We can decide procedurally. It is now 10 minutes to 12 that we can either take a short break and come back for questions, but we're supposed to start at 1 o'clock, I think, our other discussion. So we can either take questions now and discuss it. We can be discussing it all throughout the course of the week, any of these things. So whatever way people would choose to proceed, we can do that.
I have a couple questions.
What did, let me just take one in
Well,
the back. Kate.
I have a question, which
Yes.
is, why would we get to this point where we're so on the brink? Why would we have to take it to such this precarious place before we are able to? I mean, is it because we have to make a conscious choice to evolve? And so that means that we have to decide as a world, as a human family, to make this choice about why get so close to outer destruction before we could come here.
It's an interesting human question. Why is it that so many of us in our own individual lives have to be confronted with such major tragedy in our lives before we kind of rethink the course that led us to the tragedy? Because tragedy, by definition, at least by kind of Shakespearean definition, is an individual or a community falling prey to a fundamental fatal flaw within their own character. that causes them to bring the tragedy upon themselves. These problems of potential massive global warming and a potential major thermonuclear confrontation between the West and China are both problems of our own making. So and it's not as though we aren't being told. Why is it that no matter how many times people in the United States are told about the massive global warming is being caused by the emissions of these global greenhouse gas emissions, why do we keep on driving the SUVs? Why do we keep on buying them? And why does the Democratic Party, for example, put a candidate up like John Kerry, who says in the face of the United Nations International Panel on Climate Control, the IPCC, that generates the thing 10, 15 years ago, the report that says that if we continue emitting these global greenhouse gas emissions at the rate that we are, unless we reduce them by 70% per year, 70% per year by the year 2012, that will be inevitably wedded to the global warming catastrophe. Why is it that the Democratic Party puts forth a candidate like John Kerry that rather than saying we have to reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions by 70% by 2012, suggests that we might reduce them by 20% by 2020? I guess because it has kind of a ring to it. Let's reduce them by 20% by 2020. I guess it's a tune you can dance to. And but it doesn't do you a bit of good. It's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And so he comes forward and proposes this particular policy. And when Dennis Kucinich says, look, we've got to follow the International Panel on Climate Control of the United Nations and reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions, have a major new strategy for alternative energy, etc., that everybody says, isn't he awfully short to be president? Yeah, I don't know. Why. So it's one can come up with a number of cosmic analyses as to why our human family does this type of thing, but it has to do with the concept of sin. It has to do with the concept of free will. It has to do with the ultimate question of, that we were talking about last night. Why did the infinite sea of eternal consciousness actually generate any type of differentiation at all at the beginning of all of this? What is the purpose of all of this? What is the play that is underway here? And what is our role in it, if any? What is the role of free will of the individual human being in the collective community in the teleology of our cosmos? Your answer depends very much on which worldview you happen to adopt. So Jason, go, and then we'll come back to Randy.
I have a couple of quick ones. You said that John Edwards will run as a progressive populist.
Yes.
What leads you to believe that? Because I just I don't get that feeling from the guy.
From long conversations
from
with
previous
his campaign chairman.
And is there a difference between a rhetorical campaign versus is he genuinely in that camp? Or, you know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah. No, he is. It's interesting when he. One of the great advantages to John Edwards is that, other than the fact that he is a child of a man who worked in the textile mill that he's told everybody a few times, which, unlike Joe Biden's stories, turned out to be true. John Edwards. And he also was in Washington for only one term, and he'd been a trial lawyer for all this time. He came in as the senator and came in from North Carolina, and he didn't become part of the Trilateral Commission. He didn't become part of the Council on Foreign Relations. He didn't become part of all their clubs, and he spent half of those 6 years campaigning to be president. So he wasn't even in town where he could get kind of contaminated by all of that activity. And he's very much open to it, very much open to this. And basically one of the qualities you can see about him is that he's in a certain sense kind of a born Southern preacher. And he made the mistake in his early life of translating that into being a trial lawyer. But the fact is now he's in a position where he knows this. And a second piece of information is that his wife Elizabeth, who is now in complete remission, has just joined the National Board of Directors of the Covenant for a New America, of the Sojourners Community, where all of those policies are in fact being articulated. And I'm assuming that that wasn't because she didn't have anything better to do.
The other one I was curious about is you call like McCain, Giuliani, and I assume Bush and company reactionaries.
Yes.
And like from my perspective, it seems more of like a Hegelian situation of problem, reaction, solution, where they're not simply just reacting to something that's happening out there. They're more manipulating it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me.
So I just the term reactionary kind of suggests that something happens and you react to it. I mean, that's a piece of what's going on, but I think that they're more involved with it than simply, reacting.
All right. The fact is that it isn't really problem and potential solution and solution. It's actually thesis and antithesis and synthesis was the Hegelian analysis for the dialectic. And it's materially grounded, absolutely materially grounded. And what really we're looking at in the longer range, what makes it reactionary, is that in fact the thesis that they're pursuing is the thesis of Caucasian nation-state-based capitalism and international imperialism. This is in fact the same 19th century organizing principle that was generated after Hegel in 1821 set forth his fundamental critique of natural law, an alternative theory of right, pursuant to which the Hegelian dialectical dynamic was generated. And it was set forth primarily to replace the natural law worldview that had been operative in Western civilization up until the end of the French Revolution. And but that other very special historical moment, similar to the one I'm talking about now, here at the end of the Cold War, obtained after the French Revolution, from 1791 to 1821. We're talking about a 30-year period there. In that 1791 to 1821 period, the major leaders of the ruling classes in Western civilization, the ecclesial class, the royalist class, the landed aristocracy, and the mercantile class, who had all been joined together, and their powers, respective powers, have been institutionalized in the bicameral House of Lords and Parliament of Britain and transferred to the United States. Not coincidentally, between 1789 and 1791. Same exact time of the founding of the American Constitution, the creation of our entire theory. It was just transferred from there in the form in which it had been institutionalized, and it came over here. And what happened is that when the peasantry rose up against the French royal classes in Europe, and they were terrified it was going to spread throughout Europe to disenthrone the royalist class and the ecclesial class who were partners with them. That what happened is when they finally suppressed the revolution in France, primarily because the unlanded and the unpropertied peasantry had no worldview, had no systematic affirmative worldview pursuant to which to organize themselves. All they did is responded and started screaming and hollering about all the oppression, etc. And the ruling class, after the Reign of Terror of Robespierre, they were so terrified by this that they sent out word throughout the entire departments of philosophy, throughout the universities of Europe and their theology schools, to find some alternative mode of ethical reasoning to replace natural law. Because if these peasants ever grokked what natural law was all about, they would do the same thing that each of the leadership of each of those ruling class members would have done, is they would have laid claim to this faculty. Just like the mercantile class, which was the latest partner, did it through the Protestant Reformation. They said that because the mercantile class was hardworking and parsimonious and industrious, these were all external signs of an inward grace of God that enabled them to perceive the laws of the universe. That's the classic Calvinist ethic of the Puritan working class. That's where it came. That was the articulation of it. Just exactly like before them, the landed aristocracy had in 1215 at Runnymede, had confronted King John at Runnymede, and they put forth their Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, which nobody's ever read, except maybe a few of us, that what it says is specifically that we, as the landed aristocracy, are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights that enable us to participate in acting as a veto power on the king, who represented the royalist class, which represented the previous class of people, all of whom were appointed by the Pope. from the ecclesial class appointed the leadership of the royalist class. So this group of people had generated this, pursuant to the natural law worldview, had begun to build a larger and larger partnership. And they were so terrified that the peasantry was going to get this thing, that they had to take natural law, the natural law mode of ethical reasoning, off the table. They had to disenthrone it as the mode of ethical reasoning of Western civilization, so they needed an alternative theory of right. And that's what the leaders of the philosophy departments and the theology departments throughout Europe were doing for a 30-year period until 1821, when Hegel postulated this fundamental critique of natural law, an alternative theory of right, the dialectic. And so, as I said, that it generated this thesis, antithesis, synthesis premise, because at the root of the Hegelian analysis was that there was no such experience. This experience that's asserted at the core of the natural law worldview, that you can have this intuitive experiential union with the universe and make normative decisions predicated upon that, is completely false. And therefore, since we have no way of getting access to the truth in any ultimate sense, all you have is your five senses and your intellect, and you can come up with your own thesis. And someone is going to come up with an antithesis. And those are going to have to clash and struggle together to generate a synthesis, which will become nothing more than a new operating thesis. And it's going to generate its own antithesis, etc. Now that went on from 1821 all the way to 1845, when Nietzsche, taking into account the new data that had flowed from Darwin in the theory of natural selection, which was published in 1845, that Nietzsche took this and he says, oh look, this idea of the dialectic that Hegel has postulated in 1821 has been going on now for 25 years. Not a long time. It's been around for 25 years. What they did is he materially grounded the abstract theory of the dialectic in the material plane by asserting that the way in which the dialectic is playing itself out on the material plane is in a fundamental dialectical struggle between der Übermensch, which is the apex of all biological human evolution. And at the apex of biological evolution stands the Übermensch, which is the Caucasian, European, white people. And they are in fundamental dialectical struggle with the aboriginal people of the world. And therefore, they generated the 19th century organizing principle of the white man's burden and the manifest destiny that caused us here in the United States, right at that time, at the end of the Civil War, to sweep across the entire continent, eliminating the Native American people, aboriginal people, evolutionary throwbacks. You know, same thing they did in Africa and set up the colonies there, and the same things they did in India with the British. You know, and it became the organizing principle, the thesis, if you will, of the major nation states of Western civilization. And that went on all the way from 1845, basically all the way to when? 1917. When what happened? When the Chautauqua movement had not yet succeeded in dissolving away a belief in the Hegelian dialectic as the mode of ethical reasoning to reassert the natural law. What happened instead is that the Bolsheviks in Russia overthrew the Tsar in October of 1917 and disenthroned them and set forth the clear antithesis to Caucasian-based, nation-state-based capitalism. And that was a universal, global, international, non-Caucasian-based communism. And they went at it. And they became the thesis and antithesis, which has been going on for almost 80 years throughout our entire lives. Every single person in this room. From the time that we were born until 1991, December 31st, we lived in that dialectic. And what I'm saying is that when the Soviet Union collapsed on the night of December 31st of 1991, all that happened is when the antithesis collapsed, the heroes of the thesis, which is your point, Jason, is that they're not in reaction to anybody. It's their thesis that they're asserting. They're in active, affirmative endorsement and aggressive implementation of their thesis, which is Caucasian, nation-state-based capitalism and international imperialism. And that's what they did. They said, well, look, our opponent has fallen in the field, so let's get right back to it. And so they went right back into citing Mark Hanna and McKinley and all the guys that were in charge, and giving all the money to the major corporations and giving them tax breaks and huge monopolies coming into power. And so they've retreated right back to that exact same position. And so you're absolutely correct that even though they're reactionaries, because as members of the dialectic of a thesis and antithesis, it's a reactionary worldview in reaction to each other, the thesis and antithesis. When there's no opponent in the field, when there's no antithesis presently operative, it looks exactly like all they're doing is pursuing their thesis, just exactly as you say. And that's how it explains to you why it looks so much like that. And that's how you can tell what it is. And that's why I'm suggesting that what we need to do is, rather than make the tragic mistake of trying to figure out what the new antithesis is to their same old thesis, and just continue the fundamental dialectic, is don't accept Hegel's premise at all.
Oh, yeah.
Understand that
Yeah.
the natural law worldview is true. And go back to the Chautauqua movement, which is an absolutely, uniquely, genuinely American experience that we had, that has generated every single progressive movement and issue that we all hold dear in this country. And go back and pick it up and carry it forward and go everywhere around our country and set up the tents and use the internet and use the videotapes and get all of our singers and dancers and get them out in the country, just like they did in the Chautauqua, where they were singing and reading poetry and dancing, and always telling the people what's going on and telling them what the worldview is that you're espousing. And it's got to be translated into concrete principles, program, and policies. You know, and there needs to be candidates who go out and take these positions and articulate them. Because unlike the solutions, the positions that are being taken by these other candidates, lo and behold, these will solve the problem. If you adopt these particular policies, you will solve the problem, not just more effectively address it, like the liberals tend to, for the most part. So what I'm saying is, you're right, Jason, that it at the present time has the appearance of them being just pursuing their own affirmative thesis, with basically not in reaction to anybody. But the fact is, you need to track it back farther to find out who it's in reaction against, and it's actually the Caucasian leaders of the Western nation states that view themselves as being in reaction to the threat posed to them by the Aboriginal people of the world. Okay? Sarah Love, you have your hand up?
At the risk of sounding really sort of practical, I just wanted to speak to what Kate said. When you were raising the question of how did we get here, I think there's some just very practical things as well that it's good to look at. And one is that the boomers, the idealist generation that did all of the things in the 60s and 70s to confront hypocrisy at that stage around the Vietnam War, etc. And where that was the Black Civil Rights Movement was happening, the feminist movement, everything from the Chautauquas was happening in the 60s, because the Chautauquas were another idealist generation. And then it started repeating itself with the boomers, because they come every 4 years. The idealists come every 4 years. And there's a repeating every fourth generation. And what happened was we all got involved in nonprofits, because it was clear to us that nonprofits were a way that we could fund this work. And thousands of nonprofits were set up by boomers on every topic you could think of, to research, investigate, educate, etc. With some policy development, but legally we were limited in a nonprofit. We were not supposed to work in elections. We were not supposed to endorse candidates. We were not supposed. So while this huge wave of idealists was creating nonprofits and figuring out everything, the right wing at that time was forming. They formed an alliance even earlier than the 60s. They formed an alliance between the hard right, the religious right, and then ultimately corporations in whose interest it was. And this alliance, highly well-funded alliance. They now have 42 think tanks that they've developed in the last 50, 60 years to investigate and figure out how to win. They focused on elections. Our people were focused on them in the nonprofit field for the most part. And we were not very excited about the Democrats. I mean, God bless the feminists and, you know, all of the progressives that have tried so hard to work with the Democratic Party. I mean, because Alex Neal always knew you had to do it because we didn't have any other choice. I mean, we tried to even start a third party. The feminists did in the early 90s.
Called what?
We call it the 21st Century Party, but it never really got off the ground. And but the point is, we weren't that happy with the Democrats because they weren't listening. So we were focusing on the nonprofits. They, on the other hand, were focused on, they did the Southern strategy under Nixon, which shifted things dramatically in terms of the election process. And they focused on how to win, and they began to take over the media so that they control the media in the red states through Clear Channel Radio and stuff like that. It's horrific what people hear. And when I drive through the red states or work in the red states, I am horrified at the stuff that I hear on the radio. I mean, how could anybody vote in a knowledgeable manner if that's what their education source is? So this is huge, I think. The other thing that's huge practically is that the boomers have been raising their kids. They're just coming out of that now. And the idealists are always supposed to have a second life, which is as mentors when they're older. They come back into the idealistic phase. And I would say this to all boomers and all other generations too. I mean, we're not being exclusive about this. It's just that the numbers of the boomers and the civics are so big. We've got to stop thinking about our kids. I've had to do this too. I mean, I'm trying all the time. You got to stop thinking about your kids as your kids and start thinking about them as allies. And all their friends, which is why our two kids were here at least for a few hours. We have had a policy for the last 10, 12 years, never have an event without people in their 20s and younger. Just don't do it. Make it a policy.
And perhaps we should do it the other way too, where we should encourage the millennium generation to not have an event without some boomers in there.
Right. Exactly, because that alliance is so key. I mean, the young people, the teachers in the schools began to say, as the civic generation started coming in 24 years ago, as they started going through the educational system, the teachers started saying, oh, there's something going on here. They're interested in the environment, they want to do this, they want to know more about social issues. And that's natural for that civic generation. But what's different about the civic generation than the idealists is they are the ones that put rubber to the road. So we are talking, figuring out, educating, researching, and they say, okay, so let's get it done. And they just go like that. And the policies start coming into place, and the structures start changing, and the technology hits the road, and blah, blah, everything. And the last civic generation was the World War II generation. And when they returned from the war, wow, everything in the country changed. I mean, my father was part of that. They built the whole community. The road came in, the nursing home got built, the school got rebuilt, the pool came in. It was all just bam, bam, rubber to the road. That kind of an alliance between the visionaries and the educators and the rubber to the road, young energy, is not beatable. It's unstoppable. And we just have to stop thinking that we're overwhelmed, they've got control of everything, they're in total power. It's just a passing, it's a moment in time. And so, but the other thing that I wanted to say to add too, is that that alliance between the hard right, which used to be just a tiny blip on the screen, the hard right with the religious right and the corporation. That was the only hope that the hard right ever had of being a voice, because the religious right was a grassroots base. They had churches. And their form is to have their minister tell everybody what to do. So go out and vote, do this, do this, do this, do this, and people do it. Well, but what we have to understand is it gave them a spiritual or religious foundation. And if you'll notice what Danny said about the people coming into the ruling classes, i.e. the people who make the laws and decide how things are going to be, they come in with a spiritual justification for their participation. And the progressive community, in our opinion, really has to understand that, well, I don't know how to say this without, I'll just say, I think, I won't say anybody has to understand anything. I'll just say, my sense of things is if we don't get our connection with the cosmic force and the force of creation, whether we're talking sixth or seventh paradigm, if we don't get that, we don't receive and benefit by the incredible power that is available to us and is being given to us in every single day. If we shut ourselves off from that, that same co-creation is going on with all the worldviews, including the lower manifestations. You know, and to cut ourselves off from that is like making ourselves teeny. I mean, we're just little specks in the universe anyway. And so, and when you see what they did, how they brought that in, and they have a very clear worldview, and they've been a train on the track ever since. And they have worked out their differences in the interest of unity, and they've been a worldview train on the track. And that kind of power, that reactionary power like that, we haven't seen since Hitler, because he was a reactionary. In order to deal with that, and McCain's policies, even though he seems like a great guy, Danny says every single one of his votes is reactionary, for the most part. Maybe not the torture thing, but I mean, if you look at his voting record, you know he's a reactionary. No matter what he sounds like, says, looks like, etc. So you have to do that. But if we don't get our clarity with our worldview and what our religious base is, what our connection to the cosmos is, what our alignment is, we can't have the kind of train on the track that we need to help steer this into the new paradigm. I mean, it's going to go there eventually anyway. The question is, can we get it to go there before too much more damage to the earth?
I feel as if I only understand perhaps 1% of what you've said today. It's very complicated material. You've obviously been a student of it in an intellectual way for a long time and are able to retain and to repeat. And this is why you're a great speaker and a great teacher. People like myself do not learn well. I don't retain well, and I don't know a whole lot, except I do know a lot viscerally. I mean, it's that the fact that I'm not a good learner has made me rely on my instincts a great deal. I don't instinctively feel that Edwards is a candidate that I would go for. I respect what you're saying about that he's going to run a progressive movement. How do I know? I mean, I'm not even sure by virtue of the things that you've said, because they are, your notions are so based on other notions of yours. And so therefore, I don't want to be a person who follows the sheep and the sheep of my friends who are the other sheep. So therefore, I think deeply about who I instinctively feel I can be attracted to as a candidate, and probably the last person I felt that strongly about, and who I'm not even sure that it wasn't my parents who were the major sheep in those days that I was following, was John Kennedy. You know, he had the charisma and whatever. Otherwise, I wasn't really aware of I liked Ross Perot a lot. I felt that he was a barrel of laughs, and maybe that's what I was liking about him. So, for those of us who aren't going to go out and read all of those books which are on our reading list, or get in touch with the Chautauqua movement, what would you, for somebody whose visceral reactions are very strong, where would you say to cut those off and to try, and what would you just give me your suggestions on what you would say to somebody like myself?
I think that's very important because I think in a very important way that is the role of the artists. The artists who get it and can translate it into parables, into simple songs that go for 3 minutes, and put it with the music, with the right octave tones, with the right energy, with the right parable perception, can communicate it to people who respond viscerally like that. That is the absolute role of the artists in this thing. And that's why the music was such a huge part of our whole life. It has always been, because of the thing in the 60s. I mean, the 60s would not have been the 60s without all of our musicians and singers and songwriters that were talking about the whole thing. And people don't have to be able to read anything. All you gotta do is hear it, and it'll just stop you wherever you are. You'll turn and you'll say, like with Jackson's Blood on the Wire. You don't have to understand the Nicaraguan Contra thing or anything like that. You gotta just, wait a second, what the hell is that? That's absolutely true. Who are these men in the shadows? That have always been making wars everywhere, and the places we can't even name. What the hell is going on around here? And that's why the artists are such an absolute essential part of this whole movement. And that's why they were an essential part of the Chautauqua movement. They went on the Chautauqua constantly and sang their songs, like Pete Seeger, that kind of thing. And only it was Woody at that time, and that's what they do. And so that's what I'm saying is that what's important is to have some of the members of the artistic community who kind of have a more complex, like John Hall, and they do all that kind of reading thing, Jackson, Bonnie, they're always doing that stuff, and say, look, let's get our community back together again. Let's have everybody gin back up again, and get back to it, and write the songs and sing the songs.
When I was and I worked with John Hall, and I
Yes.
was with all those people on the anti-nuke
Yeah.
issues, as did Katie, and I'm not really sure to what degree I was believing them and therefore taking their songs in to my lexicon.
Yes.
But to become a thinker for oneself, you sort of have to. It's a collection of my instinctive thoughts, of my instinctive brain working.
Mhm.
Some of the instincts go slightly against each other,
That happens.
and
You
so.
have different songs.
But I'm not going to include the good things that Orrin Hatch thinks in
Right.
in my most liberal songs.
You're right. That's right.
And yet Orrin Hatch is able to have liberal thoughts, is able to do very,
Yeah, on the vitamins and all that stuff. He's got some really bizarre positions on that are very good. But see, my sense is again that's why in your lexicon of songs you have different songs. They convey different moods, and they aren't always completely consistent. For example, you sing to a person that you love that they're just a big egomaniac, and they probably even think the song is about them. but it's true, and you got these conflicted feelings about them, and you put it out there, and people who hear it, they go, "Yeah, isn't that right?" And that's all it is. That isn't a big encyclopedia of data or anything, but that's what you do as an artist.
But the main thing I wanted to ask you,
Yes.
and I want to cut through all the other material, how do you, if my visceral reaction tells me not John Edwards, how do I get on the John Edwards train?
Okay, I would say basically through the movement for renewal, that whole kind of evangelical thing is different, and that whole thing of a covenant for a new America, it's much more visceral, it's much less intellectual, it's not into a kind of a rational domain, it's into kind of an emotive domain, and it's a lot more simple, and that's why they sing hymns. They sing hymns, and people get the hymns. and they're all, it's all part of that evangelical movement.
Well,
So-
maybe that's the way to relate it, but that's not how I want to take it in. I mean, if I take things in more with the right side of my brain than the left side of my brain, doesn't that have a real value?
Oh, yes.
Isn't that,
Yeah, absolutely does.
which doesn't mean I don't cut the rational stuff out. But
No.
there's so many rational things that you have just talked about today. Which things of those do I take into consideration and which things of those don't I?
Sarah's making an offer. Sarah is our nonlinear visceral champion. Sarah, love, what do you think in response to that?
What I would suggest is meeting.
Excuse me, but
Danny,
remember
Danny.
that Sarah was the national executive director of the Muse Foundation for the
I wasn't the
So go ahead,
director. I was on that board.
All right,
I was on that board. I was not the director. I don't think there was a director.
Sarah, may I put you up here while you speak?
Well, I'm just going to say one thing. It's okay.
For the
Darling.
recording and so everyone can see you?
Yay!
No, I was just going to say, if I were you, I would meet him and spend some time with him and with Elizabeth.
Speak up, Sarah.
I said if I were her, I would meet, and she would be able to do that. You know, I would meet him, and I would spend some time with him and with Elizabeth. Who I saw Elizabeth on television when they were campaigning together, when they were running with Carrie, and I thought, oh, this woman is fantastic. And I don't know if you've ever seen her, but she was just so real and so regular and so well informed about all the different policy positions. And I mean, she was clearly able to go out and campaign by herself. No question about it. And so, I mean, if you spent time with them and you could feel who they are, you would know, I think. And I think you have to trust yourself. If you decide to vote for McCain because that's what your inner self tells you to do it.
Well, the problem is that McCain was the sheep of the day, or at least he had all my friends, the sheep, in his umbilical cord that ran straight to him. So everybody was McCain, McCain, McCain. He's the Republican that can make it all work and can be friends with the Democrats and with the left and the right wing. And now that is not true. It's become not true because we've learned so much more about McCain.
Right.
Is there more to learn about Edwards? Of course. There was a lot more to learn about Kerry. I used to know Kerry quite well. And I've been, Kerry was a different person 10 years ago. So was Kennedy. We all were different people, 10 years ago. Is Edwards going to be the right person from 206 to 210?
Well, I think that there are certain things we can look at to help us. Well, one is the experience of them and their energy fields. Because we can tell a lot, particularly if we're sensitive, we can tell a lot just because we're picking up information from a person's field. And so that direct experience, I think, is very key, particularly for people who are tuned in like that. Secondly, on the more rational side, looking at the history of their votes. Like we should know, I have not done this, you may have done this, I know you've done it with McCain, but we should know how Edwards has voted on because his history of his votes tells us, what he's actually doing in the Senate. What he's actually supporting and not supporting. That's a very key thing. And then, I watched him carefully in the thing that happened with Elizabeth. I watched him carefully in the interviews and stuff about how he handled himself as a candidate when she got that health challenge. And I was impressed. He stepped back, he gave her the floor, in terms of them interviewing her about her health challenge. He was supportive. It was really impressive, actually. There's just different clues about people's character.
Absolutely, it's the clues.
It's the clues to the character. And I can only say for myself that that I've been impressed. The thing that I haven't been so impressed with, I don't know if this is going on this video.
It is.
He's just a little, he just has a little sense of being younger. But it's 4 years later now. But in the last campaign, I kept thinking, he seems a little young for running for the president, not the vice president, but for the president. But we're 4 years later and he's been through a crisis. There is nothing like the kind of crisis that they've been going through for the last year with her health challenge to mature people. And you know, going to the question that Kate says, why do we go through all this stuff? Well, I mean, it's been our experience, having been through several going through the tunnels, that while they are painful and while they are extraordinarily difficult, they have so many gifts and so much wisdom. So they've just come out of one that has been an enormous, without question, there's no way it couldn't have been, enormous growth challenge for both of them and their kids, even though their kids are little. So that's interesting. And but anyway, I still just go back to trust yourself, trust yourself, trust yourself. I mean, I think that is really key.
And get to meet them.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, if one has that, I mean, if I can, that'd be great if everybody in the room could.
Yeah.
Yes.
And, you know, because everybody's vote is just as important as everybody else's.
And see, that's part of why the really wise people that are running for leadership positions like that try to get with people. If they get with as many people as they can, because so many people are more intuitive than they are kind of rationalistic. And so that they say, look, I was with this person, and boy, they really have great vibes. You know, these people have great vibes. And of course, that was Carrie's problem. You know, and that's part of Hillary's problem. You know, when she's out on the campaign trail, that's a problem. And so that with John and with Elizabeth, they have great energy. They're very open, and it's I think it'll work.
And also, I think, I mean, we have always, or in recent American history, focused so much on the individual that we're electing. And the whole point of what you're talking about today is a completely radical change in perspective.
Right.
And if you've got a decent guy, a bright guy, who's espousing that perspective, he will then bring in the people who will support it.
That's right.
And so that's key to me. I wouldn't have been turned on to Edwards as I like him, but not as an individual, not for what you're telling me.
Yes. Yeah, it's a campaign of principle, policy, and program, not of personality.
Right.
But we do know as realistic people that there has to be an adequate personality there, because so many people process it in a kind of a non-linear way. And they don't even know what the policy positions are. And that's one of the great advantages that McCain has. McCain comes across as a very likable, affable, honest guy with integrity. You know, and so many people are attracted to him, and they don't really realize that his principles and policies and programs are totally reactionary.
Yes, and something to add to that, which also goes to your question. Balancing the intuitive and the research, rational research, is really important. Now, an example, just quickly, an example of this is that when George Bush Jr. ran, he called himself a compassionate conservative, and we all fell for it. I mean, almost everybody fell for it. And because we all want a compassionate.
Not enough to enable them to have actually won.
Yes.
We might point out.
Exactly. But I mean, I don't want to say, but I said to Danny, I said, this is real trouble. This is real, because I can tell. I the intuitive part. I used to say to Danny when Ronald Reagan was speaking, we're losing, Danny, we're losing, he's winning. And Danny would say, how can you say that? He's just ridiculous. Because you can tell that the movement of the heart, how they're strumming the heart and things. And that's what happened with the term compassionate conservative. On the rational side, his policies are anything but compassionate. His policies are not compassionate. And that's why we have to weigh the two. Because, you know, if we only do the intuitive, there are 42 think tanks that they have been figuring out one of the things they've really focused on is how to frame the language, what words to use that will strum our hearts. And they're working on it right now, so that McCain or whoever their candidate is going to use all the right words and make us feel confident as emotional human beings in this other emotional human being. But they're orchestrating it now, you know, in a way that has never been done before. The level of intricate orchestration of the emotional message, and it came naturally with Reagan, but now they're orchestrating it, and so we have to be alert to that.
Okay, but yes, Jim.
I was wondering what would maybe change your thesis, is what events might occur, and I'm particularly thinking about the fact that I think it appears to me that there's a fairly high probability, or at least some probability, that after the November election this year that we're headed for a major military confrontation with Iran, and how that might affect things.
Well, it's only going to get worse for W, because one of the major mistakes that they're making is they're starting to believe their own propaganda. that they actually are out there, and they think that there's this Al-Qaeda group that they've gotten kind of the leaders knocked off on, and they're picking off their main leaders and stuff, and that the Hezbollah that the Israelis had to deal with in southern Lebanon, that they're like kind of two different groups. One's the Hezbollah and one's the Al-Qaeda. What they're not acknowledging is that it's all the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood has been known by anybody who basically reads, you know, that they've existed for 120 years, and that their whole dedication is to drive infidels out of the Holy Land, and that's a one common thing that they've got. And they're just completely fantasizing about this whole thing. And so in this idea that we have to maintain the integrity of the state of Iraq, you know, we just can't allow it to be dismembered. You know, Iraq didn't even exist until 1922, and it was created by a commission that was chaired by Winston Churchill, who was the Undersecretary of State for the British Crown for Colonial Affairs. And they just created it after World War I because it had oil in there, and this was the British claim to the oil in the territory. And, you know, like, well, George W. might well not know that because you would have had to gone to class. But the fact is that everybody in the Muslim Brotherhood knows about it, and there are 2.5 million of them. Not like, oh, the Al-Qaeda is this little tiny group and we're picking off their leaders. There's 2.5 million of them. And these people, the 130,000 U.S. troops in Iraq are totally surrounded. Totally surrounded. They can't even go to the airport without getting shelled. You know, and yet they're trying to pretend they're winning. You know, and then they're in Afghanistan, and they say, well, they got Afghanistan secured. They don't have Afghanistan secured. You know, they've holed up in a few little cities, and the Muslim Brotherhood controls the entire countryside. You know, 3/4 of the people that they've designated as the provincial leaders for their new government are part of the Muslim Brotherhood. You know, the United States ambassador from Saudi Arabia to Turki bin Faisal is part of the Muslim Brotherhood. Turki bin Faisal was sitting in the meeting in August of 1991 trying to persuade King Farouk and Crown Prince Abdullah not to allow George H.W. Bush Sr. to bring in the infidels into the Holy Lands. And you know who was sitting there in the meeting with him? Osama bin Laden was sitting in the meeting with him saying, look, I'll bring my 10,000 troops up out of the Khyber Pass that we just got through kicking the butt of the Soviet Union, and we'll kick Saddam Hussein out. And King Farouk said no, because King Farouk was in the Saudi Arabian royal family, are completely dependent upon the United States government to keep them in power because they're a total fascist totalitarian regime that's completely unsupported by the people in their country. Not unlike the Shah of Iran, not unlike Anastasio Somoza, who was put into power, as a matter of fact, in part by George Herbert Walker, strangely enough, who was the chairman of Brown Brothers Harriman, who ran the United Fruit Corporation. You know, and while it is true that just knowing all these things doesn't actually solve everything, because it's difficult to communicate all of that to everybody because they don't want to hear all that data. The fact is, it's important to at least know what you're doing. And that the problem with George W. is that he doesn't. And that the people who are so attached to their worldview, this thesis, Jason, that we're talking about, this affirmative thesis of Caucasian nation-state-based capitalism and imperialism, are just being driven by this blind thesis that they've got. And they think that all they have to do is keep pushing on the thesis, and well, let's wait to see what the antithesis looks like. Well, they found out what the antithesis looked like in Vietnam. You know, the French found out about it in Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The Americans found out about it at Khe Sanh. You know, when you're totally surrounded by millions of people who hate you, and our American GIs can't figure it out. I wonder why they hate us. You know, we've invaded their entire country, you know, and we're killing them and their kids and blowing them up, and they still keep disliking us. You know, and you say, there's kind of a disconnect here somehow. And so what I'm saying is that if they make a move militarily against Iran, you know, all it's going to do is bring in the it's funny because one of the things that people don't keep remembering is that the Iranians are not Arabs. They're Persians. And they'll bring in the entire Persian Empire against themselves. You know, they're only now dealing with the entire Arabian Empire. You know? And if they make that one move, I mean, it's the worst thing they could do. I mean, it's the worst. If you listed a whole bunch of things, the only thing worse they could do is attack China. You know? They're going to attack Iran, and they're going to bring in the entire Persian world against them, join now with the Arab world, which sets aside the potential tension in the Muslim world between the Arabs and the Persians. But, you know, you sit down and try to explain that to George W., and he won't know what you're talking about. You know, but Richard Pearl does. You know, the Dark Prince. You know, who was their Assistant Secretary of Defense. You know, and the other people know about this. You know, Bill Kristol knows about this. William Mellon Scaife knows about this, who are funding them. You know, so what I'm saying is that if in fact they make that move against Iran, and in fact W intends to, there'll be an article coming out in the New Yorker magazine next month by Cy Hirsch.
Yeah.
It'll talk about it. You know, but the fact of the matter is, George W. says he's the only one who's going to be president, who's going to have the cojones to go in and do what has to get done, is to wipe out that little nest of vipers there in Iran, with the theory that somehow the religious Muslim clerics don't represent the people. And if you can just sort of get rid of those that handful of Muslim clerics, you know, the people will all accept democratic principles and stuff like that. You know, which, I mean, they wouldn't recognize a democratic principle if it bit them in the butt. You know, the Republicans. You know, take a look at the elections. You know, and all their debold machines. You know, they don't have any respect for democratic principles. Look at their suppression of all the minority votes in Ohio and all the things they do. And they don't have any respect for democracy.
And that news gets out in the rest of the world.
Well,
it doesn't get out here.
Well, actually, it's not even news to the rest of the world. You know, the news doesn't get out here, but it ain't news to anybody outside of the United States. They all know what they're doing. So anyway, Randy.
First of all, you're as compelling a speaker today as you were 25 years ago when you spoke at Haverford College and convinced some of us to really join the anti-nuclear movement, which really shifted many of our lives. So thank you, and it's wonderful to hear you. I'd like you to focus, change the discussion a little bit more locally, although I did want to say that Rob and Rebecca brought David Barsami in to speak at one point. He has a show called Democracy Now!, and he was saying that ultimately we want to encircle China for the coming fight with China, and that's why we're in Iraq. And it kind of makes a lot of sense, which suggests that invading Iran is inevitable because Bush does know what he's doing. He wants to encircle China for the coming debate. But that's a national discussion. I'd like you to focus a little more on think globally, act locally. The notion that we're going back to our communities. A lot of us have a great deal of skepticism about national elections because of diebold machines and because the integrity of voting machines is very much in question. So that suggests, well, maybe we can do this at a local level with support from folks in this room. I'm trying to do it with clean drinking water because 60% of communities are fluoridated with this ridiculous fertilizer waste that contains lead and arsenic. But there are a lot of different ways we can do it. You can help provide, I hope, some tools for kind of, instead of the local all leading to the national, which the talk has been so far about, to try to change our present. The national can help us locally make changes and produce societies or communities that are much more livable. So,
Yes.
in that regard, one thing I'd like you to do is to explain the different worldviews that you've alluded to a lot. Maybe take a minute out and tell us what they are. And two, try to give us some of the examples of local power that we can take back to our communities as we have these Chautauqua type meetings.
Okay. Well,
Daniel, can I
yes,
say one thing?
yes.
I feel the need to say this. I don't know if it's just for myself or if it'll be helpful to you all, but everything that he's been saying about the Middle East, this is difficult, I think, because we went through 9/11. This is the anniversary of 9/11, and there are confusing things about this process for our whole beings because of the trauma of 9/11 and stuff. But I just want to kind of say something really simple, and that is if we remember, if we keep in mind that we are caught in a worldview that is them and us, and we've been caught in it for a long time, certainly the whole last century, our whole lives. And we had the World War II, we had the Cold War. This is all the them and us worldview. And if we try to think our way out of this inside that box, it gets really confusing. So we have to realize that the situation in the Middle East, and however 9/11 happened to us, and there's debate about that we know one thing for certain, and that is, as a people, we have not been told the truth about the real implications of our foreign policy. And our foreign policy is not the same thing as our domestic policy has been. People experience us in ways abroad that we have not really experienced at home, except in the Black community or the Native American community or whatever, which is significant. But as Caucasians, we have not experienced ourselves in the same way that people internationally have experienced us. And so the first 3 weeks after 9/11, I saw a number of people on television being interviewed who were telling the truth about the history of our foreign policy and how it may have contributed to 9/11 happening to us. And after 3 weeks, it stopped, and I haven't seen it since, except it's kind of coming back now. I saw somebody a week ago or so that was giving some details about our foreign policy in the Middle East that could explain this hatred. So it's hard, but I think we have to step up to the plate and realize there's a history here, and we've had a role in this, in what has happened to us. And it's not a big mystery, really. And it isn't that they don't like democracy. That's not it. So, and also if we keep in mind that this worldview has control of things now, it doesn't have to have it forever, and we have other choices. And in history, there's a time in which a worldview is more appropriate. In other words, there was a time when we didn't have schools and all that stuff where the king was appropriate. A benevolent leader would be the highest manifestation of that worldview, and a terrible dictator, ruthless, brutal dictator, would be the lower manifestation of that worldview. But there was a time when it was important to have a king or a queen, and ideally it would be a good one. We're in a time, we believe, this is an important point to make, we are in a time of transition. And we're going through the pains of that transition, of being caught still in a worldview that is destroying the earth in different ways, in a whole bunch of different ways. We're doing that in this worldview. And so we need to move out of it into one that is in harmony with natural law and in harmony with nature and and with one another, etc. So we can move into a more hopeful and integrated and cooperative and appreciative and globally healthy worldview. And we have that option. We're not forever stuck. We shouldn't be despairing.
I just want to, Randy, let me suggest this, is that it probably, without being presumptuous, but it probably would be important to cover the whole range of all the different worldviews in probably some session this week because of the importance of it and the details that you might want to have. And we have, to assist us in this, we have this initial graphic of what the higher manifestation and the lower manifestation of the worldviews look like, and what the different subcomponent elements of it are, its cosmology or creation story, and its theory of human teleology. It's probably going to be appropriate to have us address this in not a kind of a brisk thing, which would be appropriate right now, but in a more detailed presentation. Number two, I think that there's probably going to be a session as well where we try to talk about, well, how does this all translate? We've discussed all this during the course of the week. How can we individually, going back home to our respective places, what would we all think together would be a good thing to do on a local basis of how we do all this kind of thing? So I think there are two questions. Both of your questions are, in fact, so important that probably they're entitled to like a whole session to deal with them. Okay? So, and we'll do that. And what I want to do very briefly, because I don't want to have to do this one thing I'm going to talk about before I get to this off, is that very briefly I want to touch upon, since it is 9/11, and it is the anniversary of 9/11, and this is perfectly natural that this issue has come up about what was the path to 9/11. We're going to possibly, I don't know what the timing is tonight, all watch ABC's show about the path to 9/11, the second half of it, where they really start blaming the Democrats for having done this thing. We might want to look at that and have some discussions about it. But what I want to do, sort of, in a sense, introductory to that, I want to give at least a brief moment of an explanation of what in fact happened at 9/11. I mean, it seems, depending on the timing that we have here.
We actually need to take about a 10-minute break.
Yeah.
And I asked that if everyone could just wait until the food is set up to start taking it. And then it would be great if everyone could stretch, use the bathroom, come back in here, and while we eat, we can just continue the discussion, and people can talk and ask questions.
It actually, based on about 30 years of experiences, it's not a good idea to do that. I mean, but we can do it and break.
We need to do that.
No, okay, but we should do that then. And what I'll do is I'll save this because if you would like to explain what the details of this are. I mean, you've heard little touches on about Turki bin Laden. I don't even know that Turki bin Laden or the Turki bin Faisal is even the foreign minister for Saudi Arabia. But there are certain very, very, very important things that you need to know on this day, this particular day, so that you'll know what it is that happened to us. Okay, and it will take another time. We'll do it when we find a good spot to do
Great,
it.
so save that.
I'll save that one too.
Right, and the discussion can continue for anybody who would like it to
We can do that. Because we can do a chatty thing over eating, which is a bit of a major kind of focused presentation. This really doesn't work.
If people need to leave, it's 1 now, be back by 2:30. Oh, but you're all welcome to stay and continue the discussion. Thank you. This was not planned, and I'm sure that you will have a lot of interesting insight for us.
Yeah.
Hopefully some positive things.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, all right. Here's the, so we got like 30 minutes to actually decompress from that event. But last night, it's now September 12th, and what we all experienced last night in watching the ABC special on the path to 9/11 was in my opinion, a rather historical type of moment. That in watching the full kind of basic propaganda piece come out from ABC television, almost like it was a news event, actually, because it was integrated in with the whole day's thing of having news specials about 9/11, and everything was being pitched as news. And as we now know, a lot of the news isn't even really news. It's kind of like PR stuff. You know, whether it's, you know, telling you about how, you know, what was going on down in New Orleans in the flood, it's all kind of retrospective analysis stuff. It's not like news. And that was going on all day yesterday when we were meeting and having our various discussions. That was going on by the news channels, on CNN all day. And then this movie, made for television movie, despite the kind of denial at the beginning, say, oh, this isn't real, this was a fictionalized account, and that we've, for dramatic purposes, had to fictionalize things and make up fictional scenes and fictional characters, and you know, but it was like, you know, spent like 12 seconds saying that, and then the whole thing was designed to be as much like a real experience as possible. You saw the kind of way they were doing the camera work of like it was all jiggling around, and they were putting you right in the truck with a news team, etc. So that was an astonishing display of kind of propagandistic devices that was going on by ABC. And as you may know, ABC is owned by Cap City, and Cap City is a major corporation with extremely conservative to reactionary members. Bill Casey, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency under Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr., was on the board of directors of that company, to give you some idea. And then, of course, right halfway into the movie, which they were advertising all month long, it's having no interruptions, no breaks. It was all of a sudden they had this big interruption. Special. And it's a big ABC special event. And people go, wow, what is this? Has something happened? You know, has there been another attack? Is it this frame of mind that you were in? And there it is, on comes George W. Bush. And it was very, very reminiscent. The energy that was generated around that was very, very reminiscent of President John Kennedy with the Cuban Missile Crisis. For those of us that remember that,
yeah.
When Ani came and said, people said, "What is this all about?" The president's making a special announcement. They were going for that kind of archetypal energy. And when I was watching, I said, you know, this is really something. You know, this whole event that they're doing here with this propaganda, because the theme through the entire path to 9/11, what kept being consistently repeated is, oh, we're not prepared, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough surveillance, we don't have enough staff people, we don't have enough computer capacity. And it was a major propaganda pitch throughout the entire story about how we needed to have a national security state. In all of these guys were presented as fanatics that were just trying to, you know, in the actual framing of Bush's speech last night was, well, a lot of people are suggesting that this is a clash of civilizations, but this is actually a war on behalf of civilization itself. Against these primitive kind of Neanderthal forces of this primitive and distorted vision of religion. I mean, it was astonishing, actually, the intensity of that whole operation. And so what I wanted to do, just in the brief time that we have here this morning, and we can decide whether later in the course of the next couple days we have together, whether we have some fuller discussion of it, because in 20 minutes here we don't really have time to get into all of it. But what I can tell you is that what you note about this is there was absolutely no attempt to give any kind of objective explanation about how all this happened. The path to 9/11, you know, was portrayed simply as though the United States executive branch didn't have enough money and power and authority to wiretap people and do all of that kind of stuff, or coordination between their FBI and the CIA and equipment to protect us. And so therefore the message that one would be left with at the end of that thing is, let's get to it. Let's get, and they even showed that the 9/11, and Keene, who was the head of the 9/11 Commission, who was an official in the Reagan-Bush administration, the guy they put in as the objective head of the 9/11 Commission, ended up actually being an executive producer of that particular piece. And so that the fact that they put at the end, they put, well, you know, there were 12 different grades that they gave them, and there were, you know, there were 12 Fs and 8 Ds in 1 A. And the A they got was on the final coordination, better coordination between the CIA and the FBI. Well, the reason that there hadn't been the coordination between the CIA and the FBI is because at the very beginning of the creation of the CIA in 1947, they said, look, the one condition on which we'll ever conceivably allow an organization like this to be set up is that it doesn't have any communication with domestic law enforcement. Because the one message that democracy knows is if you have a domestic political police force, you know, they will always take over the government. That is what they'll do. And so that the sole condition on which anybody agreed to allow the CIA to be set up was that under no circumstances would they be allowed ever to meld with the domestic law enforcement people. And so what that whole thing that they got the A on, the one single A that the commission gave them, is that finally they removed that barrier between domestic law enforcement and the Central Intelligence Agency's political police force. Okay? And so that what I want to say in the limited time that we have is that we know what the information is as to what the real path to 9/11 was. And the real path to 9/11 wasn't that we just didn't have enough surveillance equipment and right to wiretap people's telephones and set up video cameras on the streets and see who's there. You saw those little pictures of, oh, here's a video camera, we watched this person going. They kept interspersing the regular camera shots with surveillance shots of people in black and white that they had taken at airports and all of that stuff. And you even heard somebody one time say, I wonder if they know we're watching them. Did you hear that?
Yeah.
I wonder if they know we're watching them. You know? And so that what the real path to this whole event that occurred 5 years ago yesterday is actually a very intricate and important story that I'd be more than happy to tell you. I can't tell you in just 10 minutes, but I'll give you some idea of it right now. That this entire matter, again, tracks back all the way to beginning in 1821 with this thing with Hegel that I mentioned yesterday. That when Hegel in 1821 wrote his fundamental critique of natural law, an alternative theory of right, and working with the other intellectuals of Europe of that time, they eventually developed this by 1845 with Nietzsche and Darwin, actually into this concept of the late 19th century, concept of the superior Übermensch, of the apex of all biological evolution, that was the Caucasian white male, basically, that was in dialectical conflict with the aboriginal nomadic people of the world. The white man's burden and the manifest destiny concepts that were generated by that became the major organizing principle of the late 19th century that drove all of the imperial ambitions of the United States and the European nations for the entire end of the 19th century. And as I pointed out briefly yesterday, what we're living through right now is that when that late 19th century thesis, under the Hegelian concept of a thesis and an antithesis, clashing with each other, and the thesis being Caucasian nation-state-based capitalism and imperialism as the organizing principle for Western civilization, that was confronted, as I pointed out yesterday, starting in 1917, with its antithesis of international, non-Caucasian-based communism. And that dialectic went on for some 80 years. from October of 1917 all the way to December 31st of 1991, which we all recall now having happened just 15 years ago with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And what we're experiencing now is that with the collapse of the antithesis to the late 19th century thesis of Caucasian nation-state-based capitalism and international imperialism, what happened is that the proponents of that particular affirmative thesis or organizing principle for Western civilization rose back into the ascendancy and said, let's just retreat back to that particular thesis as our organizing principle to replace anti-communism. And that's what we're seeing the administration. All of this big long pitch that went on by George W. last night is an assertion of all of the primal themes of this fundamental worldview of Caucasian nation-state-based capitalism and imperialism, to the point where the classic argument is that it's actually a war on behalf of civilization itself. Against whom? Against the uncivilized. That's what it is. It's a war against the uncivilized, the enemies of civilization. And civilization being identified is the Caucasian-based European American civilization, which we're trying to bring the benefits of to all of these Aboriginal people around the world. So that, I mean, we could have lived 100 years and never hear a more paradigmatic assertion of that particular worldview than you heard last night, live, in the context of a major propaganda push to try to convince people now that the Cold War is over, this is the worldview that we should be adopting. Even to the point of saying that if we don't adopt it, they're going to overwhelm us. All of these forces of uncivilization are going to overwhelm us, and pretending that they hate freedom and they hate our way of life, and they're going to come all the way across the world to destroy us unless we go get them first and convert them, get them to actually abandon their entire worldview and adopt our worldview. So that's what you were hearing last night. But in fact, what this is, what's really going on here, is that these people were in fact reacting to, they were attempting to engage in a preemptive effort to stop the United States from actively invading them, which is exactly what the Bush administration was planning. And that the George W. Bush administration was from before they got into office. And here's just some basic data. In October of 1999, now this is before they were elected, quote elected, a year later in the year 2000, they held a convention in Jerusalem of some of the major thinkers of that Project for a New American Century. And they said that we've got to really identify terrorism. It was 1979. 1979. In 1979, they held this meeting in Jerusalem, and they said, we've got to get anti-terrorism identified as this enemy. And it will become our organizing principle, so that we have a new ultimate other against whom to organize if the Soviet Union is going to be defeated. And we need this people. And so that is where these things began and started. And this has been a tactic that's been going on now since then. And as I mentioned yesterday, when we, in 1984, just 5 years later, in 1984, came across these people, we were actually doing the American Sanctuary Movement defense down in Brownsville, Texas. And long and interesting story, which I don't have time to tell you now, but doing the investigation of the American Sanctuary Movement criminal defense we were doing down there for a Catholic nun and a member of the newspaper and another Catholic worker that had been arrested for aiding and abetting refugees. We uncovered this group of Oliver North and Jack Singlaub and Richard Secord and Albert Hakim and the others that were all providing weapons illegally to the Contras down in Nicaragua. And when we began to discover who these people were, they were all involved in anti-terrorism. Oliver North was the deputy director of the National Security Council in charge of anti-terrorism. He was working with the anti-terrorist special working group inside the White House. And he was working with the anti-terrorists in the FBI. And they were working with a special unit of the operations directorate in the Central Intelligence Agency in charge of anti-terrorism. And it was all anti-terrorism everywhere. And so we began to tell people in the context of our working on the investigation of this, that there was a terrible danger that was coming here. That there was this whole group of people that we referred to as the pit bulls of the national security state, the midnight armies of the national security state that were in operation, and that we had to get these people put out of business before they actually got in charge in our country. And that's what the whole Iran-Contra investigation was really all about. But in the context of that investigation, what we discovered is that these people that we're talking about here had in fact been involved over a long period of time in working in alliance with the Saudi Arabian government. And this is something that you're going, when this all comes unwoven, which it will, when this all comes unwoven, you're going to discover that in fact it wasn't coincidental that 14 of the people involved in the 9/11 operation were Saudi Arabian. And so you would say to yourself, well, why is it that we attacked Iraq? And and why is it we're now talking about attacking Iran? If 14 of them were Saudi Arabian. And why is our major alleged ally here Saudi Arabia? Why is it on 9/12 today, when everybody was ordered to stand down, all flights all throughout the United States, you all remember that? Why is it that it was the Saudi Arabians that were given permission to go around gathering up their people and flying them the only planes in the sky today, 5 years ago, over the United States were the Saudi Arabians that were being flown out back to their home country. And what I can talk with you about at greater length at another time is how you track what's happened here from the point of the actual creation of the state of Saudi Arabia, and the creation of the state of Iraq, and the creation of the state of Iran, and the creation of the state of Yemen that they had last night, where the ship was attacked, the Cole. All of those nation states were created in October of 1922. They were created, as I touched upon yesterday, by a special commission that was chaired by then Under Secretary of State for Colony Affairs of Britain, Winston Churchill. And there were only 2 Arabs on the entire commission. All the rest were British. And they said, how are we going to put in little cookie cutter definitions of these nation states all through the Middle East so we can get fair shares of all the oil given to the different countries? And that's why Iraq became a British protectorate. And that's why Iraq was, that's why the British were in there for 32 years, until they were driven out. And the creation of Saudi Arabia was done in a way in which, as you probably know, the oil contract that was established with Aramco, the Arab American Oil Company, it was established with Abdul Aziz. Abdul Aziz became the major contractor to the Aramco Oil Company, the cartel of 7 major oil companies, Standard Oil, New Jersey, NorCal, and the others. That he signed the contract agreeing to give those Western oil companies 90% of all of the profits from the production of the oil in what was the physical territory identified as Saudi Arabia, in exchange for which the 10% royalties would all go to him and his family. And he would use those monies to purchase military equipment in which he would set up a total fascist, royalist government that would assert dominion and control over all of that physical territory and would protect the oil for the West. And that is why they, when Saddam Hussein went down and attempted to, quote, invade Kuwait in September of 1991, that is why King Faoud of the House of Saud, the second youngest son after King Faisal, the second youngest son of Abdulaziz, invited George W. Bush, the oil family magnate of the Bushes, to bring in foreign military forces into their country, to occupy the country, to not only continue to control the oil, but to keep the House of Saud in power. Because, just to give you some, I'll give you some idea of what we can talk about in more detail later if you want to know, so I can give you some detail. But the fact of the matter is, on July 15th of 1991, when George Herbert Walker Bush, the President of the United States, whose Secretary of Defense was Richard Cheney, when it finally, he came to the full realization that the Soviet Union wasn't going to last much longer and was going to ultimately be dissolved, he was completely concerned about the fact that there had been a secret agreement established in February of 1972 by Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, actually during the secret flights to China. When they went to China and had that great secret opening to China, on their way back, they landed in Iran and met with the Shah of Iran, the Pahlavis, and went into Saudi Arabia and met with King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah and Turki bin Faisal, King Faisal's son. And they made a deal. They said, look, the 60-year contract that had been signed by the House of Saud and the Pahlavi family with the Aramco was getting ready to expire. And so what they did is they established a new secret agreement to extend for another 60 years the exclusive lease agreement that Aramco had to the oils in Saudi Arabia and in Iran. And in exchange for that extension of the 60-year agreement, that Kissinger and Nixon agreed that the Iran in Saudi Arabia would be allowed to increase the price of oil from what was at that time 34 cents basically a gallon to $1.34 a gallon. But they had to agree, in order to be able to raise the price like that out of that additional $1 a gallon that they would be getting, that they would agree, A, to use a significant portion of those funds to purchase military equipment from exclusively United States military industrial corporations, like the AWACS and the over-the-horizon radar and all the stuff that they bought. Number two, however, they had to agree that they would use a significant remainder of that other money, the additional money they had, to build a brand new set of major military bases all through their countries and dig out the channels so that American warships would be able to harbor in those channels, and to also be able to build major landing strips and airfields, so that in the event that either the Soviet Union or China made any military feint to seize the oil fields, that the Shah of Iran and King Faoud would in fact invite the United States to come in and occupy the oil fields of the Middle East to protect them against incursion by the Soviet Union or China. This was the secret agreement, and there's nobody here that's ever heard of the agreement. No one's ever found out about the agreement. The reason I know about the agreement is because one of my major sources stood physical security for the meetings, where they actually held the meetings. And he was a fluent Farsi speaker. He was the chief of security of the U.S. military mission in Tehran and was in charge of security for the meetings. And so he told me all about these things. So those meetings that agreement was established in February of 1972. And so what happened is in 1991, July, when George Bush Sr., H.W. Bush, who you may remember is who Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger took back in 1972 to become the new ambassador to China, to open that whole thing up. Remember that? That's George H.W. Bush. He, in fact, as President of the United States in July of 1991 now, says, uh-oh, the Soviet Union is getting ready to dissolve, which they did in December of 1991. We're going to lose any potential excuse that we're going to have to ever go and occupy the oil fields. But as long as the Soviet Union is going to be dissolving now and our ultimate adversary is going to be disappearing, why don't we in fact go and occupy those oil fields? Well, we'd have to have some excuse under our agreement that someone is getting ready to come in and try to invade the oil fields. And so what he does is he does a handwritten personal memo to Saddam Hussein on July 15th of 1991, which is sent over to April Gillespie, who is the United States ambassador to Iraq, having her personally hand-deliver the memorandum to Saddam Hussein, which says, Saddam, dear Saddam, since you and I have had this really interesting ongoing relationship since the time I was the head of the CIA, providing military funds for you and everything else in your war with Iran, I'm offering you an offer here. If you determine that it will be necessary in order for you to resolve your dispute with Kuwait about allegedly engaging in slant drilling under the borders and taking oil out of Iraq, if you decide that you want to resolve that dispute by military means, it will be of no great concern to the United States. At which point Saddam Hussein mobilized his military forces and goes down onto the border of Kuwait, and the very next day, Richard Cheney, as the Secretary of Defense, calls in Prince Bandar, the ambassador of the United States from Saudi Arabia, and in a meeting at his office tells him on July 17th, says to him, oh, what Saddam Hussein is getting ready to do is invade Saudi Arabia and is going to oust the House of Saudi. And so what we want to do is we want to set up a special meeting so that me, Dick Cheney, can go and have a meeting with King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah and talk them into invoking the old 1972 agreement and inviting us to come in and occupy the oil fields, is what she does. He flies over there and has a meeting with them in the second week of August. They have these meetings, and Dick Cheney asks for permission to bring the U.S. military forces in to occupy those harbors that have all been dug out for them. And who was it that did the digging out and the building of all those military bases? No. The Bin Laden construction company.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, they're the ones that built all this. And who's in, and so that when, let me finish this one moment. And what happened is that when King Faoud was asked by Cheney to invite them all in, there was a huge row that broke out. In the next 2 days, there were 2 days of meetings held with King Faoud, Crown Prince Abdullah, Turki bin Faisal, who was their 26-year chief of security intelligence, and in the meeting with them was Khalil Mahfouz, who was in fact the chairman of the Royal Saudi Bank. That he ran that part for the family, and Mohammed Baroum was the owner of the largest construction operations now with concrete and steel, major multi-billionaire, and Osama bin Laden. And they had this 2 days of meeting saying, do not do this. Do not allow these infidels to come into our holy lands because they will not leave. They will occupy our land. And King Faoud, in order to keep himself in power, ended up, they were saying to them, don't do this. We will drive them out. We will drive Saddam Hussein out ourselves. Osama bin Laden will get his troops. He's got 10,000 troops sitting up in the Khyber Pass that just got through kicking the butt of the Soviet Union and driving them out of here. They will bring their troops down and drive out Saddam Hussein. And the fact is, King Faoud said no. and invited Bush to come in. And Bush came in and occupied the place, pushed Saddam Hussein back into Iraq, and then never went in and got him. Just sat back and said, oh, we've got a no-fly zone. We have to leave 200,000 United States military troops, Air Force troops, and Navy forces here to supervise the no-fly zone. And at that point, Osama bin Laden said, this is jihad.
Right.
That we are going to drive you out of here. And he was supported by Khalil Mahfouz, the head of the Royal Saudi Bank. He was supported by Mohammed Baroum, the wealthiest man in the place, and by Turki bin Faisal, the chief of security, who, by the way, after 26 years as the chief of security, resigned 4 days before 9/11. Because he knew that it was coming. Because he served as personal security for Osama bin Laden, who was going out and marshaling all the forces of the Muslim Brotherhood to drive the United States and the infidels out of the Holy Lands, which is what we really see going on here. That this is an effort to drive the U.S. out of the Holy Lands for their military attempt to occupy the oil fields. That's what's happening here. And Osama bin Laden is not just the head of the Al-Qaeda, he has become the military commander for the Muslim Brotherhood. And he's supported by everybody, including Turki bin Faisal, who is now the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States. Okay, and stands personal physical security for Osama bin Laden. Okay, so that's what's really happening here. And that you need to understand strategically what's happening in order to know tactically how to respond to it, so you know logistically how do we respond to an experience like that last week. And if anybody's interested later, I give you more details about that.
Could we schedule that?
Okay. It's up to everybody.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax-deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.